somewhere in the wide blue heart of the Pacific Ocean, far from any continent, there lies a small green island called Pohnpei. It rises from the sea like a soft, misty mountain wrapped in rainforest. Clouds gather around its peaks nearly every day. Streams fall down its slopes in silver ribbons, feeding rivers that wind slowly to the coast. And all around this island, a great ring of coral reef holds back the open ocean, creating a wide, shallow lagoon of gentle turquoise water. On the eastern edge of that lagoon, resting directly on the living coral, sits one of the strangest places built by human hands anywhere on earth. It is a city of stone. Not a village, not a temple. A city. Nearly 100 small islands, laid out in a neat pattern, separated by quiet water canals. And every one of those islands is artificial. Every one was raised, piece by piece, from the reef itself, using massive columns of dark volcanic rock. Some walls still stand more than 7 meters tall. Some stones weigh as much as 50 tons, and the total weight of the material used to build the site is thought to reach hundreds of thousands of tons. The place is called Nan Madol, and no one alive today can say for certain how it was built, or why, or by whom. Before we go further, the planet has a new quiet wonder to share every night. If you'd like, one waiting for you each evening, subscribe and let it come to you. Try to picture the scene from above. A green volcanic island, crowned in soft cloud, a pale blue lagoon curving around its edge. And then just off the shore, a dark grid of stone rectangles, laid out on the shining water, like the bones of some forgotten dream. Mangrove trees have grown up between the walls now. Their roots dip into the tidal channels. Small fish move through the shadows. The stones are wet where the tide touches them, and dry above, dark grey in some places, streaked with rust and green in others. The columns that make up the walls are long and straight, six-sided, stacked in tidy layers like enormous cords of firewood. The strangest thing about those columns is that they do not belong here. The coral reef beneath Nan Madol is a soft, living foundation. It cannot make its own stone walls. And the basalt columns above are not native to the side of the island. They came from somewhere else, from quarries that appear to lie many kilometers away, on the far shores of Pohnpei. Some researchers believe the stone came from even farther. To place these columns where they now rest, someone had to move them across the land, across the water, across the reef itself, and stack them into towering walls that have stood for centuries. We do not know how they did it. That is the honest heart of the mystery. There are guesses, of course, and gentle theories, and old stories passed down through generations. Some traditions on Pohnpei speak of 2 brothers, sorcerers, who lifted the stones by magic and set them into place. Some researchers wonder about rafts and rising tides and clever ropes. Others think of long ramps of coconut logs, or of sledges pulled by hundreds of hands. Each idea has its supporters. Each idea has its problems. None of them fully explains the scale. And scale is what makes Nan Madol so quietly astonishing. This is not one temple. This is not one tomb. This is roughly 92 separate artificial islands, spread across nearly 70 hectares of reef, connected by canals, surrounded by breakwaters, and built at a time when the people of Pohnpei had no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals. They had stone, they had rope, they had wood, they had the sea, and somehow they had a shared purpose strong enough to move mountains of basalt out onto a coral shelf in the middle of the Pacific. Tonight, we are going to sit with that purpose. We are going to walk slowly through the canals of a city that has no living residents. We will pause at the walls of the royal enclosure. We will drift past the tomb where an unknown chief may still lie. We will listen to the tide as it slides between the islets, moving through streets that were laid out long before any modern map. And we will not try to solve the mystery. We will only try to feel its shape, because Nan Madol is not just a puzzle. It is a question set in stone, resting on a reef, waiting quietly under the Pacific sky. Let us begin, gently, with the simplest picture. Imagine a small, warm island in the western Pacific Ocean. The island is called Pohnpei. It sits far from any large landmass, about halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines, a green speck in an enormous blue sea. Around this island grows a long coral reef, curving out into shallow lagoon water, and along the eastern edge of that reef, hidden inside a wall of mangrove trees, rests a strange and quiet city, made entirely of stone. The city is called Nan Madol. In the local language, the name means something close to the spaces between. That is a fitting name, because Nan Madol is not one solid place. It is a scattering of small, flat islands, and the spaces between them are filled with water. There are about 92 of these islets. Some are as small as a tennis court, others are the size of a city block. They lie in a rough grid pattern across the shallow reef, separated by narrow channels of seawater. The channels act as streets, but they are streets you can only travel by canoe. When the tide comes in, the water rises around the walls. When the tide goes out, dark mud and coral gravel show through. The whole layout covers about 75 hectares. That is roughly the size of 150 football fields, laid side by side. If you tried to walk from one end of Nan Madol to the other, you would pass under low branches, wade through soft water, and climb over stones that no one has moved in centuries. The stones are the strange part. They are not river rocks. They are not carved boulders. They are long, straight columns of black basalt, each one shaped like a giant pencil, with 5 or 6 flat sides. Basalt is a volcanic rock, hard and dense. When certain lava flows cool very slowly, the rock cracks into these neat column shapes on its own. The cliffs of Pohnpei have some of these columns. So do a few other places on the island, but most of the columns at Nan Madol seem to have been brought from the far side of the island, or possibly from another island entirely. Each column can weigh several tons. A single one may be as heavy as a small car. Some are longer than a canoe. The builders stacked these columns in crisscrossing layers, like logs in a woodpile, to make walls. In places, the walls still stand more than 8 meters tall. That is about the height of a 2-story house. The largest walls are said to contain columns weighing 20 or even 50 tons each. The total weight of stone across the whole site has been estimated at around 750,000 tons. That is a number so large, it is hard to hold in the mind. It is roughly the weight of 2 Empire State Buildings, moved column by column onto a coral reef in the middle of the ocean. No one is entirely sure when the building began. The oldest layers may date back to around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, though the great stone walls we see today were mostly raised between about the year 1200 and the year 1600. That gives us a project spanning many centuries, built by many generations of hands, on a foundation of living reef. And that foundation is the second strange thing. Nan Madol is not built on solid ground. It is built on the reef itself, on top of coral, in water that is only knee to waist deep at low tide. The islets were made by piling up boulders and coral rubble to lift small platforms above the sea, and then facing those platforms with the great basalt columns. In effect, the builders made their own land. They created an archipelago inside an archipelago. We do not know how many people lived there. Some estimates suggest a resident population of only about 1,000, mostly nobles, priests, and their servants, with food carried in from the main island. Other researchers have wondered whether the number might have been higher, at least during large ceremonies. The question is still open, so this is what we begin with tonight. A small volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific, a shallow reef curving off its shore, 92 little islands made by human hands, hundreds of thousands of tons of black stone stacked in patient layers, a city with water for streets, and a quiet mystery sleeping under the mangroves, waiting for us to wonder about it. To understand why Nan Madol feels so strange, you have to understand the stones. They do not look like normal stones. They look like logs, long, dark, six-sided logs of rock, stacked in tight rows the way you might stack firewood against a cabin wall. Some are short and thick, no longer than your arm. Others stretch out to the length of a small canoe, 5 or 6 meters from end to end. They are heavy in a way that resists all understanding. A single column can weigh several tons. The largest may weigh 20 or more. These stones are a kind of rock called columnar basalt. Basalt is what you get when lava cools. Nearly all of the ocean floor is made of it, but most basalt is just a shapeless dark stone. Columnar basalt is different. It forms when a thick sheet of lava cools slowly and evenly, and as it cools, it shrinks. The shrinking pulls the rock apart into tall, straight-sided columns, usually with 5 or 6 flat faces. In cross-section, they look almost like honeycomb. From the side, they look like a bundle of dark pencils standing on end. Nature makes columnar basalt in only a few places. It needs the right kind of lava, the right thickness, the right slow cooling. When it happens, the result looks so deliberate that early travelers often refused to believe it was natural. It looks carved. It looks quarried. It looks like something a stonemason spent a lifetime shaping. But it is simply what basalt does when the conditions are exactly right. On Pompeii, those conditions were right in a handful of places. The island is a volcano, worn down by rain and time, and in its interior there are old lava flows that cooled into these strange orderly columns. You can find outcrops of them along certain ridges and near certain cliffs. In some spots the columns lie stacked in the earth, like the neat contents of a forgotten woodshed. In others they lean at odd angles, half swallowed by ferns and moss. The rain has been working on them for a very long time. Here is where the mystery begins in earnest. The nearest known sources of columnar basalt on Pompeii sit inland on the far side of the island from the reef. Some sit high on ridges, some sit on cliffs above the sea. None of them sit next to Nan Madol, not one. And yet, Nan Madol is built almost entirely of these stones. Hundreds of thousands of tons of them. Some estimates place the total weight of stone at the site at close to 750,000 tons, though no one has ever counted every column, and the true number remains unknown. That means the builders had to move the columns from a quarry across land or sea to a coral reef on the opposite coast. Then they had to lift them into place, one on top of the other, in walls that in some spots stand more than 7 meters tall. There are theories. One idea is that the columns were floated on rafts, lashed to bundles of lightwood or dry bamboo that could bear their weight in salt water. Some experiments have shown that a large basalt column can, in theory, be floated this way if the raft is built carefully. Another idea is that the stones were dragged along coastal shallows by teams of workers, using ropes woven from coconut fiber and hibiscus bark. A third idea, quieter and less certain, is that some of the smaller columns were carried by canoe fleets, several boats yoked together to share the load. Each theory has its problems. Rafts of that size are difficult to steer. Dragging heavy stone across a living reef would damage the reef in ways that should still be visible. Canoe transport requires calm seas and enormous coordination. None of the theories has been proven, and none has been ruled out. The local oral tradition offers a different answer altogether. It says the stones flew. Two brothers, powerful and wise, are said to have chanted the columns into the air and set them gently in place. This is not the answer a modern engineer would accept, but it is the answer the people of Pohnpei have carried down the generations, and it tells us something about how the builders themselves may have understood their own work. To them, moving these stones was not ordinary labor. It was something closer to wonder. For now, the question of how these basalt logs crossed the island remains open. The reef holds the stones. The stones do not explain themselves. To understand the puzzle of Nan Madol, we must first understand the strange dark stone at its heart. The walls are built almost entirely of basalt. Basalt is a volcanic rock, born when hot magma from deep inside the earth rises to the surface and slowly cools. On Pohnpei, that cooling happened millions of years ago, when the island itself was still a young volcano rising from the sea. As the lava cooled, it cracked into long straight columns. Some of these columns are 5-sided, some are 6-sided, a few are 7 or 8. They look almost machine-made, but they are entirely the work of nature. This kind of stone is called columnar basalt. You can find it in other quiet corners of the world, wherever thick lava once cooled slowly against the earth. In each place, the same geometry appears. Those tall, dark, many-sided pillars, stacked like a bundle of pencils in the ground. On Pohnpei, whole cliffs of this stone still stand along the far side of the island. The columns lean and lie in great piles, some slender as a wrist, some as thick as a tree trunk. A few reach 40 feet in length. A single large column can weigh 5 tons. Some weigh far more. The builders of Nan Madol used these columns as if they were logs. They stacked them in crisscross patterns, one layer running north to south, the next layer running east to west, then north to south again. This pattern is called header and stretcher, and it is the same idea a child uses when building a log cabin from small sticks. But these were not sticks. These were massive pieces of stone, dense and heavy, quarried from a volcano and somehow carried across miles of ocean to a shallow reef. The total weight of the finished city is hard to imagine. Estimates suggest that Nan Madol contains at least 750,000 tons of stone. Some careful surveys have pushed that number closer to 1 million. That is more stone than sits in many of the Great Pyramids. And unlike a pyramid, this stone did not need to travel across a dry desert on wooden sleds. It had to cross salt water. The basalt itself is a quiet reminder of how deeply everything on Earth connects. The iron and magnesium locked inside each column were forged inside ancient stars long before our planet existed. When those stars died, they scattered their elements across space. Some of that material gathered into the cloud that became our sun and our world. It sank to the center of the young Earth, then slowly rose again as molten rock through cracks in the crust. Every dark column at Nan Madol is, in a real sense, made of stardust that took a very long path to the surface of a small Pacific island. The seawater that now laps against those columns has its own strange history. Much of Earth's water may have arrived on icy comets and dusty asteroids during the planet's early years. Some of it may have been here from the beginning, locked inside the rocks that formed our world. Nobody is entirely certain. What is certain is that the ocean cradling Nan Madol is far older than the reef, and the reef is far older than the city, and the city is far older than any living memory of who exactly built it. The reef beneath the city is made of a very different material. Coral is limestone, built grain by tiny living creatures called polyps. Each polyp pulls calcium and carbon from the seawater and lays down a thin layer of stone around its soft body. Over thousands of years, these tiny efforts add up to entire reefs, entire islands, entire barriers between the deep sea and the shore. The reef at Nan Madol is old and broad and shallow. It offered a flat, sturdy foundation just beneath the water, waiting to be built upon. So the city rests on two very different kinds of stone. Below is the pale, chalky work of countless small animals. Above is the dark, heavy work of a dying volcano. Between them lies a mystery. Someone, at some point in the long human story of the Pacific, decided to bring these two materials together. Someone quarried the columns, moved them across the sea, and set them down on a living reef in patterns that still stand today. How they did this, and why they chose this particular reef, remains an open question. The stones themselves cannot say. They can only sit in the warm water, patient and dark, waiting for the next tide. Come closer now, in your mind, to the heart of the ruined city. Picture a wide rectangle of dark stone rising out of the shallow lagoon. The walls are tall, taller than a house, and they lean inward slightly, as if trying to hold something in. This is the royal enclosure, the place the old stories call Pan Kadira. Once, chiefs walked here. Now the tide walks here instead. The walls stand in water. At low tide, the base of the stone shows itself, wet and dark and covered in a soft film of green. At high tide, the sea creeps up the walls, hiding the lowest courses of basalt. The building is half in the world of air and half in the world of water. It has been this way for hundreds of years. That slow rise and fall is the first quiet force at work here. The moon pulls the ocean, and the ocean pulls at Nan Madol. Twice a day the water climbs. Twice a day it slips back down. Each cycle is gentle, but over centuries the gentle becomes strong. Salt water soaks into the stone, then dries, then soaks in again. Tiny crystals of salt grow inside the tiny cracks. The crystals push outward, the cracks widen, grain by grain. Gravity is the second force, patient and unblinking. Each basalt column in these walls weighs several tons. Some weigh far more. They lie stacked like enormous logs in a woodpile, one across the next, held in place only by their own great mass and the careful way they were laid. There is no mortar, there is no cement. The stones rest on stones, and gravity holds them together. But gravity also pulls them down. When the reef beneath shifts, even by a finger's width, the load above must answer. A column tilts, another slides. The wall settles into a new, slightly lower shape. Under all of this sits the reef itself, and the reef is not still. Coral is a living thing, or was a living thing, laid down layer by layer over thousands of years. It is porous. It is soft in places and hard in others. When the great weight of the walls pressed down onto the reef compressed, not quickly, not all at once, slowly, like bread dough under a heavy hand. Some parts gave way more than others, and so the enclosure does not sit level anymore. One corner is lower than another. One wall leans slightly seaward. The whole royal courtyard has begun very gradually to sink. There is another force, quieter still, and it lives in the roots of trees. Mangroves grow at the edges of the islets. Their roots reach into the joints between the stones, searching for water and hold. As the roots thicken, they push. A root the width of a pencil, given 50 years, becomes a root the width of an arm. The stone above must move to make room. Some archaeologists believe the mangroves are slowly taking the walls apart. Others suggest the roots may actually be holding certain sections together, binding the stones like living rope. The truth is likely somewhere between. The forest and the ruin have become one structure, and it is hard to say where one ends and the other begins. Storms add their own hand. Typhoons pass through this part of the Pacific, and when they do, waves rise higher than the walls. Water surges through the canals, loose stones rattle. Sometimes a wall that has stood for 800 years loses a single column in a single night. No one sees it fall. In the morning the column is simply there, resting in the lagoon, waiting. What no one can yet fully answer is how much of the tilting and sinking is old, and how much is happening now. Some researchers believe the walls settled early, within the first century or two after they were built, and have been mostly stable ever since. Others suggest the sinking is ongoing, driven by the slow subsidence of the whole island of Pohnpei, which sits on a very old volcanic base that continues to cool and shrink. Both ideas fit some of the evidence. Neither has been proven, so the royal enclosure stands half drowned in its own courtyard, held up by gravity, worked on by tides, cradled by a reef that gives a little more each year, wrapped in roots that push and pull at once. It is not a building at rest. It is a building in a very long, very quiet conversation with the sea. And the sea, being older and more patient than any king, will have the last word. When that word comes, no one yet knows. On the northeastern edge of Nan Madol, one islet rises higher than all the others. Its name is Nan Douwas. The word carries the weight of centuries in the local language, and it marks the tomb that most visitors picture first when they hear of this place. Its walls climb nearly 25 feet above the coral floor. In modern terms, that is the height of a two-story house, built entirely from stacked logs of dark stone. Out on a reef in the middle of the sea, the walls of Nan Douwas are not just tall, they are thick. In places they measure close to 17 feet across at the base. Imagine standing at one end of a small living room. Now imagine that the wall in front of you is as wide as that room is long and made of solid basalt. That is the scale of the outer barrier. Even a modern crew with cranes and trucks would find the work slow. The people who built this had no wheels, no metal tools, and no beasts of burden. To feel the weight of it, picture a single basalt column. Some are short, only 3 or 4 feet. Others stretch beyond 20 feet in length. A single long column can weigh as much as 5 tons. 5 tons is roughly the weight of a full-grown African elephant. Now imagine stacking that elephant on top of another elephant, and another, and another, in a careful crisscross pattern, until the pile stands taller than most trees on the island. Then repeat that pile, over and over, around a rectangle the size of a small city block. The best estimates suggest that the entire complex of Nan Madol contains around 750,000 tons of basalt. Some researchers put the figure closer to 1 million, even at the lower estimate. That is the weight of about 150,000 elephants, laid end to end across a shallow lagoon, or, Put another way, it is roughly the weight of 2 of the largest oil supertankers ever built. The stone had to arrive, 1 column at a time, floated or rafted across open ocean, and lifted into place by hand. Nan Douwas itself is only a piece of that total. The tomb sits inside a central courtyard, enclosed by 2 rings of walls. The inner chamber is small, cool, and quiet. It is the sort of space where a single person might stand and turn slowly, touching the stone on all sides. Yet the effort to build that small, dark room required moving thousands of tons of rock across miles of water. The ratio of labor to interior space is almost impossible to grasp. It is as if someone built a mountain to hide a jewelry box. And here is the part that keeps returning to the minds of everyone who studies the site. We do not know whose bones once rested inside. Oral traditions on Pohnpei speak of the Sorcerers, a line of ruling chiefs who governed the island for many generations. Some accounts suggest Nan Douwas held the remains of the first of that line, or of a particular high priest. Other accounts point to different figures. The truth has been softened by time. When early visitors and later archaeologists opened the chamber, they found some human remains and a few objects, but no clear inscription, no carved name, no simple label to tell us who had been laid there. So we are left with a tomb, the size of a small fortress, built for a person whose identity now hovers just out of reach. The scale of the effort tells us this individual mattered enormously to the society that raised the walls. The silence of the record tells us that whatever system remembered that name has, in large part, faded. There is another way to feel the size of Nan Madol. The whole complex covers about 75 hectares. That is roughly 140 American football fields laid side by side and threaded through with canals of salt water. A person walking the outer edge of the site, from one corner to the far one, would need close to an hour, weaving between islets, wading through shallows, ducking under mangrove branches. All of this sits on a coral reef in one of the most remote regions of the planet. The nearest large landmass is hundreds of miles away, and still someone decided to build here, at this scale, with these stones, for reasons we can only partly reconstruct. The tomb waits at the center of that decision. It holds a name we no longer know, inside walls that refuse, gently, to forget. Imagine, for a moment, that you could rise slowly above the reef at dawn. The sky is soft and pale, the color of a shell held up to the light. Below you, the lagoon stretches out in shades of green and silver, threaded with the darker lines of channels between islets. Mist drifts along the mangroves. The stone walls rise from the water like the ribs of some sleeping creature, dark and patient, wearing coats of moss and lichen the color of old copper. If you were to drop lower, you would see the basalt itself. The stones are long, six-sided columns, stacked crosswise like firewood, each layer set at right angles to the one below. The surface is rough where the sea has worked at it, smoother where the mangrove shade has protected it. The color shifts through the day. At sunrise, the stones look almost warm, tinged with rust and honey. By noon, they turn a deep charcoal gray. By evening, they seem blue, cool as a shadow underwater. Now, drifting above this quiet surface, there is a story the people of Pohnpei have told for many hundreds of years. It is a story about how the stones came to be here at all. The story speaks of twin sorcerers, brothers who arrived from somewhere across the sea. Their names, in the oral traditions, are Olisipa and Olosopa. They came looking for a place to build an altar to the gods of the reef. They tried in several spots along the coast and each time the sea washed their work away, at last they found this quiet lagoon, sheltered by the barrier reef, and here their work finally held. The legend says the brothers did not carry the basalt columns by hand. They sang. Their song was so powerful that the stones lifted from distant cliffs and flew through the air, settling gently into place on the reef. When the walls were finished, one brother died, and the other ruled alone, and from him came the long line of chiefs who would live in the stone city for many generations. It is a beautiful story, and it holds within its poetry a real question. The story exists because the people who inherited this place could not easily explain how it was built. The scale of the stones and the difficulty of moving them was, even to those who lived beside the ruins, something that seemed to call for magic. The oral tradition is, in a sense, an honest admission. We are not certain how our ancestors did this, so we sing about singing stones. Modern researchers do not believe the columns floated through the air, but they too have not fully solved the puzzle. One idea is that the stones were moved on rafts, floated across the lagoon at high tide, then rolled or levered into place using ropes made from coconut fiber and logs cut from the island's forests. Another idea is that inclined ramps of coral rubble and sand were built up beside each wall so that the columns could be dragged up and slid into position. A third possibility is that many of these methods were combined, changing over the centuries as the builders learned what worked. Each theory has its weaknesses. Rafts strong enough to carry a column weighing several tons would need to be very large, and the reef passages are shallow and treacherous. Ramps of that scale would leave traces in the archaeological record, and those traces have not been clearly found. Ropes and wooden levers rot away in a wet climate, so we have no surviving tools to study. The evidence for how the stones traveled remains, at best, a set of educated guesses. And so, the twin sorcerers keep their place in the story, not because anyone truly believes in flying stones, but because the legend holds the mystery in a shape people can carry. Two brothers, a song, a reef, a city. It is easier to remember than a debate about rafts and ramps. Floating above the ruins in the soft morning light, you can see why the legend took root. The walls are so precisely stacked, the islets so carefully spaced, the whole plan so ambitious, that the mind reaches for something larger than ordinary labor to explain it. Yet ordinary labor, patient and generational and deeply skilled, is almost certainly what built this place. How exactly that labor was organized, how the knowledge passed from one crew to the next, how the stones actually arrived, those answers are still drifting like the mist along the mangroves, just out of reach. The surface of Nan Madol is beautiful and quiet. Its history is beautiful and quiet too, and mostly still hidden. Beneath the walls of Nan Madol, hidden from the eye of any visitor standing on the black basalt stones, lies a second city. It is not a city of walls or towers, it is a city of coral. The reef that holds the ruins up has been there far longer than any human hand has shaped stone. And the more researchers look at it, the stranger the story of the foundation becomes. A coral reef is a living thing. It is built slowly by tiny animals called polyps, each one no larger than a grain of rice. Over thousands of years, these small creatures leave behind their hard skeletons, layer upon layer, until a great platform of limestone grows just beneath the surface of the sea. The reef at Pohnpei is one such platform. It is old, it is broad, and it lies in the shallow lagoon on the eastern side of the island. Any builder who wished to work upon it would first have to understand it, and then find a way to make it hold weight it was never meant to hold. That, in itself, is one of the quiet puzzles of Nan Madol. Coral is not solid stone. It is porous, brittle in places, and easily broken by pressure. Yet somehow, the builders of the city laid down enormous basalt columns on top of this living, uneven surface, and the whole structure has stood, more or less, for centuries. How they achieved this remains an open question. One idea is that the builders first placed loose coral rubble and boulders across the shallow reef, filling gaps and building up a kind of raised platform. Only then did they lay the heavy basalt logs on top, using the weight of the stones to lock the rubble in place. Nobody knows the full method. What lies below the visible walls is even harder to study. Divers who have surveyed the outer edges of the 92 islets have reported layers of coral feel packed between the basalt stones, sometimes many meters deep. This design would have made them lighter than a solid stone platform, and perhaps more able to flex slightly as the reef shifted beneath them. Whether the builders knew this in a formal sense, or whether they learned it through generations of trial and error, the record does not say. Beneath the fill, the coral itself continues to live in places and to die in others. Warm currents move through the channels between the islets. Small fish drift in and out of the shadows cast by the walls above. The foundation is not a dead thing. It breathes slowly with the tides. Some researchers wonder whether the slow growth of the reef over the centuries since the city was built has actually helped to hold the islets together, sealing gaps with new coral and cementing the base of the walls in place. Others think the opposite may be true, that new coral growth pushes stones apart, and that the reef is slowly, patiently taking the city back. Sonar surveys in recent decades have hinted at deeper structures, features that lie beyond the visible walls and below the waterline. Some of these may be natural formations of the reef itself. Some may be the remains of collapsed islets or of foundations that never rose above the sea. The evidence is incomplete. The water is often cloudy. The mangrove roots that grow along the edges of the ruins make close inspection difficult. Every survey adds a few more shapes to the map and a few more questions to the pile. There is something quiet and humbling in the thought of it. A city of stone resting on a city of coral, and both of them older than any living memory. The basalt columns above were carried across the sea by human hands. The coral platform below was built one polyp at a time by creatures too small to see. Two great acts of construction on very different scales of time, meeting at a single point in the lagoon. The people who chose this place must have understood, at least in part, what they were building upon. What they thought of the reef and how they honored it, if they did, is not written anywhere we can read. It is one more thing the lagoon holds, without telling. The stone city does not sit still. Twice a day, the sea rises and falls, and the water walks quietly through the canals of Nan Madol. It slips between the basalt walls. It laps against the mossy corners of the islets. It floods the low channels and then drains away, leaving wet stone and small pools where crabs move sideways in the shadows. If you stood there long enough, you would feel the city breathing. The tides here are gentle by ocean standards. Pohnpei sits near the equator, where tidal ranges are small. The water rises only about a meter, sometimes less, but that meter is enough to change everything. At high tide, the canals fill, and the ruins look like a floating town. Dark walls rising straight from bright water. At low tide, the same canals become soft mudflats, streaked with roots and shells, and the pale bones of old coral. The city wears two faces, and it swaps them every 6 hours. This rhythm is not new. It has been happening here for as long as the walls have stood. Every stone in Nan Madol has been touched by the tide, many hundreds of thousands of times. The basalt is dark and heavy, but the water has worked on it patiently, smoothing edges, softening joints, feeding small green things that cling to the lower courses. Where the sea meets the stone, a slow, quiet exchange has been going on for centuries. The people who built the city must have known this rhythm well. Some researchers wonder if the tides were part of the design itself. One idea is that certain canals were meant to be walked at low tide and paddled at high tide, so that the same passage served two purposes across the day. Another idea is that ceremonies were timed to the water, with priests arriving by canoe when the tide was full and leaving on foot when it drained. There is no written record to confirm either thought. The stones cannot say when they were meant to be wet and when they were meant to be dry. The moon runs the whole show. Its slow orbit pulls the sea up and lets it fall, and the sun adds its smaller tug twice a month, at the new moon and the full moon. The two forces line up and the tides swell a little higher. These are called spring tides, though they have nothing to do with the season. At Nan Madol, spring tides push water further into the ruins. Low walls disappear. Doorways become windows. The city sinks a little and then, days later, rises again. The seasons here are gentle too. Pohnpei does not have snow or long dry months. It has wet and wetter. Rain falls almost every day, and the island is one of the wettest places on earth. In the peaks above the ruins, more than 7 meters of rain can fall in a single year. That rain runs down through the forest, into the streams, into the mangroves, and finally into the lagoon where the stone city waits. So Nan Madol pulses with two rhythms at once: the salt tide from the sea and the fresh tide from the mountains. They meet inside the canals and mix in slow, brackish swirls. There is a longer rhythm too, one that no human lifetime can watch in full. The reef beneath the city is alive. Coral grows slowly, adding tiny layers year after year. In some places the reef builds up. In other places it wears down. Over centuries, the floor beneath Nan Madol has shifted, and the sea itself has slowly risen. What was once a comfortable platform above the water is now, in parts, sinking closer to it. The city is being pulled down by inches no one can see. And there are cycles longer still. Typhoons come through the western Pacific in patterns that scientists are still trying to understand. Some years, the storms miss Pohnpei entirely. Other years, they slam the coast and shake the walls. The El Niño cycle in the Pacific can change rainfall, sea level, and reef health across many years. Nan Madol sits inside all these overlapping rhythms, breathing with the moon, with the seasons, with the storms, with the sea itself. How the builders read these cycles, we do not know. Whether they timed their construction to certain tides, whether they held their rituals on certain moons, whether they understood the long, slow rise of the sea, these questions remain open. The city keeps its own time now. It fills and drains, and waits quietly for the next high water to come. No islet at Nan Madol stands alone. Each small platform of stacked basalt is a neighbor to the next, and between them run narrow lanes of shallow salt water. These lanes are the canals. They wind through the ruins like quiet streets, threading past walls of dark stone, opening now and then into wider pools, then narrowing again where two islets lean close. From above, the whole place looks like a slow, careful drawing done in green and grey, with the canals as the pale lines that hold the drawing together. The canals are not deep. At low tide, some of them show pale sand and coral rubble on the bottom, and small fish flicker in the clear water. At high tide, The same lanes fill and darken, and the walls above seem to grow taller as the water rises against them. Mangrove roots dip into these channels from the edges of the islets, brown and knotted, tangled with old leaves. The water moves slowly. It carries the faint smell of salt and mud and warm stone. No one knows exactly how the canals were meant to be used. One idea is simple. The canals were streets. Small canoes moved through them, carrying people, food, stone and offerings between the 92 islets. In this view, the whole city worked like a village built on water, where paddles took the place of feet, and the tide was part of the daily schedule. Another idea leans further into ritual. The canals may have marked out sacred paths, with certain lanes reserved for chiefs, certain lanes reserved for priests, and certain lanes closed to ordinary people. Under that reading, moving through Nan Madol, was itself a kind of ceremony, and the water between the walls was as meaningful as the stone. Both ideas can be true at once. A working city and a sacred one often share the same streets. What remains uncertain is which lanes carried which meanings, and whether every canal held the same weight, or whether some were quiet arteries of trade, while others were reserved for the dead. The islets themselves seem to have had different jobs. Some hold the remains of tombs, with heavy walls and inner chambers. Others show signs of daily life, with older layers of shell and bone and cooking stones buried beneath the basalt. A few islets appear to have been set aside for the preparation of food, for the making of coconut oil, or for the keeping of eels in shallow pools. If that division of work is real, and the canals between the islets were also boundaries, a short paddle from one platform to the next could carry a person from the ordinary into the sacred, or from the living quarters of a chief into the resting place of his ancestors. The reef below shapes all of this, because Nan Madol sits on a shallow coral shelf. The canals inherit the reef's own slow breathing. Tides push water in from the open lagoon, slide it between the walls, and pull it back out again twice a day. Fresh streams from the main island of Pohnpei add a thin layer of cooler water near the inner edge of the complex. Where salt water and fresh water meet, the mangroves thrive. The canals are quiet, but they are alive. Crabs move along the walls. Small reef fish drift in the shadows. A gentle current, barely visible, keeps the water from going stale. That living water may be one reason the city was placed here at all. Some researchers wonder whether the builders wanted a site that cleansed itself, where the tide would carry away waste and keep the sacred islets from turning stagnant. Others suggest a more practical reason. A city on a reef ringed by canals is hard to attack. Any approach must come by canoe, along a lane the defenders already know. The neighbors of each islet were, in a sense, its guards. Still, the sense one gets standing at the edge of a canal today is not one of defense. It is one of quiet. The walls are patient. The water moves without hurry. Somewhere above, a seabird passes. Somewhere below, the reef continues its slow work, adding a grain of coral here, dissolving a grain there, keeping the whole platform balanced on the edge of the sea. The canals remain the most human part of the ruin. They are the places where feet once stepped down from stone into a waiting canoe, where voices carried between walls, where the ordinary business of a strange and ambitious city played out. What they carried and who they carried is a question the water no longer answers. Of all the questions that gather around Nan Madol, the oldest one, and perhaps the simplest one, is also the hardest to answer. How old are these walls really? When were the first stones laid on the reef? When did the vision begin? The site sits quietly in its lagoon, its basalt columns stacked in patient rows, and it refuses to give up a single clean date. For a long time, the accepted story placed the building of the Great Islets somewhere between the 11th and the 17th centuries. That range alone is worth pausing on. 600 years, a span of time longer than most nations have existed. Even our best guess is a window wide enough to swallow whole cultures whole. Within that window, the megalithic islets rose, the tombs were built, the canals were dredged, and the seat of the Saudulur dynasty came into being. Yet the exact moment when the first basalt log was floated across the reef and set into place remains uncertain. Radiocarbon dating has been done at Nan Madol, but the results have complicated the picture rather than simplified it. Charcoal samples pulled from the artificial islets have returned ages that sometimes stretch back much further than expected. Some early studies suggested activity on the reef as early as the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. Later work, more careful and more focused on the megalithic construction itself, tends to place the massive basalt building phase roughly between the year 1200 and the year 1500, but the earlier dates have not gone away. They sit in the record like distant lights, suggesting that people were doing something on this reef long before the Great Walls rose. One theory holds that the reef was used for smaller shrines, fishing platforms, or gathering places for centuries, before anyone dreamed of the megalithic city. In this view, Nan Madol grew slowly, layer by layer, and the towering basalt walls we see today are only the final, most ambitious phase. Another theory suggests the earlier dates may be misleading. The charcoal drifting in from older fires elsewhere, carried by tides or storms, and buried in the fill that makes up the islets. Which reading is correct? No one can yet say with certainty. What we can say is that Nan Madol is almost certainly the oldest known stone city in Oceania. Nothing else in the Pacific quite matches it for scale and antiquity together. The moai of Easter Island are famous, but they are statues, not a city of walled enclosures and canals. The stone platforms of the Marquesas and the Society Islands are impressive, but smaller. Nan Madol stands alone in its category, an entire built environment of imported stone rising from a coral shelf in the middle of the widest ocean on Earth. The heaviest single stones at the site are estimated to weigh around 50 tons. Some estimates run higher, up to 80 or 90 tons for the largest basalt logs used in the corner headers of Douwas. To move a stone of that weight, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, across open water, and to lift it into place on a wall standing several meters above the tide. This is one of the most extreme feats of ancient engineering anywhere in the world, and it was done not once, but hundreds of thousands of times, column after column, until the walls reached their full height. The total tonnage of basalt at Nan Madol has been estimated at somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 tons. The upper end of that range would make the site heavier in imported stone than the Great Pyramid of Giza. That comparison is worth sitting with. A remote reef in the Pacific holds a stone construction that may rival, in raw material moved, one of the most famous monuments on the planet. And yet, Nan Madol is barely known outside of specialists and quiet documentaries like this one. The oldest surviving oral traditions of Pohnpei speak of the twin sorcerers who founded the site, and of a long line of Sorcerers rulers who followed. But oral histories, however carefully kept, tend to compress time. Generations blur, founders become mythic. The men who first stacked the stones may have lived long before any name that has come down to us today. So the walls keep their secret. They are old, extraordinarily old for this part of the world. But how old exactly, and how they came into being over the centuries remains a question the Reef has not yet chosen to answer. There is a quiet question that hangs over Nan Madol, one that visitors rarely think to ask when they first see the walls. Where did everyone live? The city itself covers about 80 hectares of shallow reef. Its 92 islets are built from basalt and coral, packed together like the stones of a slow floating village. Yet, the islets themselves do not seem designed for large numbers of ordinary people. Many of them appear to have held tombs, priestly quarters, meeting platforms, or the private compounds of chiefs. The people who quarried the stone, hauled it, stacked it, and maintained it for centuries must have lived somewhere. And that somewhere is one of the softest, most unresolved details of the whole site. On the main island of Pohnpei, only a short paddle from the reef, the land rises quickly into steep green ridges. The soil is rich, streams run cold from the highlands to the sea. It would seem natural to assume that thousands of workers lived there, in villages along the coast, coming out to the reef by canoe each day. Archaeologists have found scattered evidence of settlement in the surrounding areas: old house platforms, broken pottery, faint traces of gardens and taro pits. But nothing yet found matches the scale that the construction of Nan Madol would seem to demand. The population footprint on the nearby shore feels, to some researchers, oddly light for a project of such weight. This is where the small details become fascinating. Soil scientists who have studied the layers around Pohnpei have looked for the chemical fingerprints of dense human settlement: charcoal from cooking fires, phosphorus from generations of waste, pollen from crops. In some places, these signals appear clearly. In others, they are surprisingly faint. The pattern is patchy, uneven, and hard to read. One theory is that the workforce was spread thinly across the whole island, each small village contributing labor in rotation, so no single spot ever grew into a great city of its own. Another view holds that many living sites have simply been swallowed by the rainforest, buried under centuries of leaf fall and root growth, and are still waiting to be found. Inside Nan Madol itself, the domestic details are just as quiet. Cooking hearths are rare. Middens, those old kitchen piles of shell and bone that archaeologists love, are modest in size for a place this large. On some islets, there are grinding stones and small basins that hint at daily life. On others, there is almost nothing but wall and floor and silence. The ratio of ceremonial space to living space seems tilted heavily toward ceremony. This has led some researchers to wonder if Nan Madol was less a city in the ordinary sense and more a sacred precinct, visited by many, inhabited by few. A place where the powerful slept among the dead, while the living world hummed elsewhere. The tiny fragments that remain are strangely beautiful. Shell beads no larger than a grain of rice, small pieces of worked pearl shell, polished smooth by patient hands, fish bones so delicate they could rest on a fingertip, pieces of pottery with faint impressions, the marks left when a woven mat was pressed into wet clay long ago. Under a microscope, these fragments open into whole worlds. The growth rings of a clamshell can show the season it was gathered. The wear on a stone tool can suggest what it cut. And yet these small clues, added together, still do not tell us how many people once moved through these canals on any given morning. Estimates for the population that Nan Madol supported vary widely. Some suggest only a few hundred permanent residents, mostly nobles, priests, and their attendants. Others propose that at its height, the wider complex, including the shorelines and inland villages, sustained a network of many thousands. Both views can point to real evidence. Neither view can close the case. The absence of clear crowding inside the islets sits uneasily next to the presence of so much cut stone. Something had to feed the builders. Something had to house them. Something had to bury them. And most of that something is still missing from the record. There is a soft strangeness in walking a place this large and feeling how empty the daily traces are, as if the city was always half a dream, more temple than town, more monument than home. Perhaps the workers came and went with the tides, leaving few footprints behind. Perhaps whole neighborhoods lie beneath the mangroves, patient under the roots. For now, the question stays open. A great stone city on a reef, and a vanished population whose shape we can only guess at, whispering through shell beads and old ash. The story of how the outside world came to learn about Nan Madol is a slow one. For centuries, the site sat quietly on its reef, known to the people of Pohnpei, but hidden from the rest of the world. The island itself was hard to reach. It rose out of the ocean, far from the usual paths of trading ships, and, even when sailors did pass nearby, they often saw only the green wall of the jungle and the pale line of the surf. The first written mention by an outsider came in the early 19th century. Spanish and other European ships had been drifting through the region for a long time, but the ruins on the reef were tucked behind mangroves and shallow water. A ship could sail past and see nothing. It took a small boat, a patient guide, and a willingness to wade through soft mud to find the stone walls at all. In 1828, a Russian expedition led by a Baltic German navigator visited Pohnpei and wrote briefly of unusual ruins on its eastern shore. The notes were short and puzzled. The visitors saw shapes that looked like walls, but they did not linger long. A few years later, an Irish sailor named James O'Connell claimed to have lived among the islanders and to have walked through the ancient city himself. His account was strange and hard to trust. He described tall stone structures and empty courtyards, but he mixed his memories with tall tales. Scholars have argued about his book ever since. For much of the 19th century, that was all the outside world had. A few passing mentions, a few sketches, a few stories carried back by whaling crews and traders. The site was a rumor more than a place. Maps of Pohnpei rarely marked it. Even the name Nan Madol did not appear consistently in foreign writing until much later. The first careful survey came in the 1870s. A Polish ethnographer named Jan Kubary, who spent years in the Pacific collecting specimens and observations, walked the canals of Nan Madol and drew the first serious maps. His notes described the size of the basalt columns, the layout of the islets, and the deep quiet of the place. He tried to understand how the stones had been fitted together. He listened to the oral histories offered by local elders, and he wrote, with genuine wonder, that no explanation he could imagine seemed to match the scale of what he was seeing. A German expedition followed in the early 20th century, when the Caroline Islands had become a German colony. The archaeologist Paul Hambrook spent months at the site in 1910. He measured walls, he drew plans, he recorded oral traditions with more care than anyone before him. His work remains one of the foundations of what we know today. Yet even Hambrook left with more questions than answers. He could describe the ruins. He could not explain them. The real turning point came much later, when modern archaeologists began to look not just at the basalt above, but at the coral below. In the 1960s and 1970s, small teams from American universities came to Pohnpei with new tools. They took core samples, they dug trenches, they studied the layers of coral rubble beneath the walls, and they found something that changed the picture completely. The islets were not natural, they were built. Human hands had piled coral onto the reef, layer after layer, to make platforms strong enough to hold the basalt above. That discovery was quiet, but profound. It meant that Nan Madol was not simply a city built on convenient land. It was a city whose very ground had been engineered. The reef beneath the stones was the first act of construction. Everything else rested on it. Radiocarbon dates from those coral layers began to give the site a rough age. The oldest samples suggested that people had been piling coral here for more than 1,000 years. The great basalt walls came later, added in phases on foundations already laid down by earlier generations. The picture that emerged was of a project spanning many lifetimes, not a single burst of building. Still, the deeper questions remained. Who first decided to build on the reef, and why here? How the basalt was moved, what ceremonies filled the courtyards. Modern researchers keep returning, each time with better instruments, each time with new sonar maps and drone surveys and chemical tests. And each time, the reef gives up a little more of its story, while holding the largest parts back. The coral beneath the basalt still guards its secrets. It has been listened to for over a century now. It answers slowly. The first surprise waits on the far side of the island. The basalt columns that make up Nan Madol did not come from the reef, and they did not come from the shore beside the reef. They came from somewhere else, entirely on Pohnpei, carried across miles of jungle, mountain, and open water, before ever being stacked into a wall. Most listeners, hearing about a city of stone, picture a quarry just up the hill. The quarry for Nan Madol is not just up the hill. It may sit on the opposite side of the island. The most likely source is a place called Sorcerers, on the northern coast of Pohnpei. There, black basalt columns lie in tumbled piles at the base of an old volcanic flow. The columns are long, six-sided and heavy, formed when lava cooled slowly and cracked into neat prisms. Some of the pieces at Sorcerers match, in size and shape, the pieces set into the walls of Nan Douwas. But Sorcerers sits far from Nan Madol. To move a stone from one to the other, the builders had to cross a large piece of tropical island, or float the stone all the way around the coast. That distance is the first thing that catches researchers off guard. This is not a case of rolling a stone a short way across flat ground. This is a case of moving a column that can weigh several tons across ridges, streams, and reef-broken sea. And it was done not once, but hundreds of thousands of times. The estimated total mass of stone at Nan Madol is enormous. Some studies place it at around 750,000 tons. Other estimates run higher. No one knows the exact figure, because no one has weighed every wall. The second surprise is that the quarry itself is not fully understood. There may not be only one. Some researchers think several basalt outcrops around Pohnpei contributed stone. Others suspect one main source did most of the work, with smaller sites filling in. The columns at Nan Madol vary in size and shape, and matching each one to its birthplace is slow work. The volcanic rock of the island shares a similar chemistry across many flows, which makes tracing a single stone back to a single cliff difficult. The third surprise is the method. No one alive knows how the columns were moved. The oral tradition speaks of two brothers, sorcerers, who lifted the stones through the air by magic. That is a story, not an explanation. The practical theories are harder. One idea is that the columns were floated on rafts, tied between logs or hollow trunks, and drifted along the coast with the tides. Another idea is that they were rolled on wooden runners across the land, then rafted only for the last stretch. A third idea combines both, with different columns taking different routes. Each theory has a weakness. Rafts of that size would be hard to build and harder to steer through reef passes. Overland transport across steep, wet jungle terrain would be brutal. No wrecked raft, no abandoned column halfway along a trail has ever been clearly identified. That absence is itself strange. In many ancient quarry sites around the world, archaeologists find unfinished stones lying along the transport route. At Pohnpei, the trail between quarry and city is quiet. Perhaps the stones were moved with such care that few were lost. Perhaps the jungle has simply swallowed the evidence. Mangrove roots, thick soil, and centuries of rain can hide a great deal. There is another counterintuitive detail worth sitting with. The basalt columns at Nan Madol were not shaped by the builders. They were used more or less as nature made them. The volcanic process at Sorcerers and similar sites produced columns that were already prism-shaped and ready to stack. The builders were not carving. They were choosing. They looked at a field of natural stone logs and picked the ones they wanted. That means the labor at Nan Madol was less about cutting and more about lifting, moving and fitting. It shifts the whole picture of the work. None of this tells us how many people were involved, or over how many generations the stones were carried. Some estimates suggest a few hundred workers moving stones slowly for centuries. Others suggest a much larger effort, concentrated across a shorter time. The archaeology has not settled the matter. The quarry sits on one side of the island, the city sits on the other, and the road between them, whatever form it took, is no longer visible. What remains is the stone itself, in place, waiting for someone to explain how it arrived. There is a story that visitors to Pohnpei sometimes hear, told quietly, half in shyness and half in warning. It says that beneath the islets of Nan Madol, below the still green water of the lagoon, there is another city, a lower city, a twin to the one above, built of the same dark basalt, resting on the reef floor where the fish drift through empty doorways. The story is old, and it is repeated in different forms by different families. No one knows for sure where the story began, and no one knows for sure whether any part of it is true. The rumor is easy to dismiss. A sunken twin city is the kind of tale that grows around any ruin near water. Stones fall, walls slump, bits of platforms slide into the sea over centuries, and imagination fills in the rest. Yet divers who have gone down into the lagoon around Nan Madol have, over the years, reported unusual shapes below the waterline. Columns lying in rows, flat surfaces that seem too regular, piles of the same six-sided basalt that makes up the walls above. Whether these are the remains of a deeper built layer, or simply columns that tumbled from the visible ruins, is a question no one has fully answered. This is where the story of Nan Madol touches something larger than itself. The city does not sit alone. It rests on a living reef, in a warm sea, beside a green volcanic island, under skies that move heat and rain across the whole Pacific. Everything here is connected. The reef grew because the ocean is warm. The ocean is warm because sunlight pours down on this belt of the earth for most of the year. The island rose because deep currents of hot rock pushed upward from far below the seafloor. The basalt itself cooled slowly inside old lava flows, cracking into those strange columns as it lost heat to the air. Every stone in Nan Madol carries the memory of fire and pressure and time, and the sea itself has not stayed still. Over the last few thousand years, the level of the Pacific has shifted, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, by small but meaningful amounts. In places, coasts that were once dry are now underwater. In other places, old shorelines sit stranded above the tide. If Nan Madol was begun long ago, some of its lower structures could, in theory, have been built when the water was lower. As the sea crept up, those lower walls would have gone under. That is one idea. It is not proven. Another idea is simpler. The islets have always been at roughly this height, and what divers see below is just the debris of walls that fell. The rumor of a lower city also connects to something inside the human mind. People who live near great ruins often feel that the visible part is only half the story. There must, they sense, be more hidden below. This feeling is not always wrong. At many ancient sites around the world, careful digging has revealed older layers beneath the ones we can see. Buildings sit on top of buildings. Cities sit on top of cities. Whether Nan Madol follows this pattern is unknown. The mangroves and the tides make careful excavation very hard. There is another connection worth sitting with. The reef, the island, the sky, and the people are all part of one slow system. Coral polyps build their tiny limestone homes, and over ages, those homes become the reef. The reef breaks the force of the waves, creating the calm lagoon. The calm lagoon made it possible to float heavy stones close to shore. The volcanic island, far away on the other side of Pohnpei, provided those stones in the first place. Without the volcano, no basalt. Without the reef, no shelter. Without the shelter, no city. Take away any one piece, and Nan Madol could not exist. So when people whisper about a lower city under the water, they are in a way telling a true story, even if the details are wrong. There is a lower world beneath Nan Madol. It is the reef itself. It is the drowned coral, the sleeping fish, the slow rain of sand and shell that has been falling for thousands of years. Whether there are also stone walls down there, arranged by human hands, remains one of the site's quieter open questions. Some researchers think a careful underwater survey might one day answer it. Others believe the answer will always slip away, buried under silt and time. For tonight, it is enough to picture the dark water and the columns that may or may not be resting there, waiting without hurry to be found. Nothing on Pohnpei stands still for long. The island sits in the warm middle of the Pacific, in a stretch of ocean where typhoons are born and grow strong. Every year, storms sweep across these waters. Some pass by, some come ashore, and Nan Madol, out on its reef, has stood through all of them for many hundreds of years. Think about what that means. The walls we see today are the walls that survived. Every column still stacked in place is a column that many storms could not knock down. And every gap in the ruins, every fallen slab, every tilted wall might be the mark of a single bad night long ago. We do not know which storms did which damage. The record is not written down. It is only in the stones themselves. Quietly out of place, typhoons in this part of the ocean can lift the sea into surges several feet high. Waves crash against the outer reef and send white water rolling across the shallow lagoon. Wind pushes the water sideways, piling it up against the walls of the islets. For a place built at sea level on a reef, this is a hard test to pass, and yet most of Nan Madol is still there. That tells us something about the builders. They knew this ocean. They knew what it could do. Some researchers wonder if the crossed log pattern of the walls was chosen partly for this reason. When basalt columns are stacked one direction, then the next layer runs the other direction. The whole wall locks together. a pile becomes a weave. Waves that might roll loose stones away have a harder time pulling apart a weave. This is one idea. Others think the pattern was chosen for its beauty, or for the way it echoed the shape of natural basalt cliffs on the island. The truth may be all of these at once. We do not know which reason came first in the minds of the builders. Between the great storms, there is a slower kind of change. Salt water works into every crack. Rain falls almost every day on Pohnpei. The island is one of the wettest places on earth. Water seeps between the stones, carries away tiny grains of the mortar and coral beneath, and drips out again on the other side. Over centuries, this slow washing hollows out the fill inside the walls. The outside looks solid, the inside grows soft, and one day, without warning, a section may lean and settle a few inches lower than it was the year before. Roots do their own patient work. Mangrove trees have found footholds all through the ruins. Their roots slip between columns, thicken, and pry the stones apart the way a slow crowbar might. In some places, the trees now hold the walls together. In other places, they are slowly taking them apart. Which effect wins in the end is an open question. Some archaeologists worry that cutting the trees back would cause more collapse than leaving them alone. Others worry that leaving them will one day bring the walls down. Both views have careful people behind them. The reef itself is changing too. Coral reefs are living things. They grow when conditions are right and die back when the water gets too warm or too cloudy. The reef beneath Nan Madol is not the same reef the builders knew. It has grown and been broken and grown again many times over. What lies beneath the artificial islets today may be a different living surface than the one the first stones were set upon. Divers who study the foundations find layers of old coral built into the base, some of it dead, some of it still alive at the edges. The sea level has shifted as well, not by much, on the scale of human lifetimes, but over the 8 or 9 centuries since the main building phase, the ocean around Pohnpei has crept slowly upward. Walls that once stood clear of the highest tide are now brushed by it. Chambers that were dry may now hold shallow water. At certain hours of the month, the city was built for one sea. It sits in a slightly different sea now. All of this change is quiet. There is no single moment you could point to and say, here is when Nan Madol began to fall. It is falling every day, a grain at a time, and holding itself up every day, a root and a stone at a time. What remains for us to see is the balance of these two forces over many centuries. How much longer that balance will hold, and what the ruins will look like 1,000 years from now, no one can say with certainty. Around Nan Madol, the light does not fall the way it falls on open beaches. It filters, it bends, it slips through the arched roots of the mangroves before it ever touches the stone. The trees stand in the shallow water like patient guardians, their roots plunging down in tangled bundles, their leaves closing overhead in a soft green ceiling. To walk into Nan Madol by canoe is to leave the bright glare of the tropical Pacific and enter a slow, dappled twilight that never quite becomes day. The mangroves that surround the ruins are mostly red mangroves with a few other species mixed in. They grow in salt water. They anchor themselves in mud and coral rubble with roots that arc out from the trunk like flying buttresses. In the still lagoon around the islets, they form thickets so dense that a person on foot cannot pass through them. Only the old canoe channels, cut long ago between the walls, still allow quiet passage. Above the canopy, the equatorial sun is fierce. Pohnpei sits close to the equator, and the light there is heavy and direct, at midday, but by the time that light reaches the basalt walls, it has been broken into fragments. Small coins of gold drift across the dark stone. They shift as the wind moves the leaves. The walls, which are nearly black when you see them up close, take on a mottled look, as if they are breathing slowly in the shade. The color of the stone is part of what gives Nan Madol its strange atmosphere. Columnar basalt is dark grey, sometimes almost blue-black, and it drinks in light rather than reflecting it. In full sun, the walls would blaze with heat. Under the mangroves, they stay cool and damp. Mosses grow on them. Lichens spread in pale patches. Small ferns take root in the cracks between the columns. The stone is alive with quiet green things that would not survive in open sunshine. At dawn, the light comes in low and horizontal. It slides beneath the mangrove canopy from the eastern edge of the reef. For a short while, the canals fill with a soft amber glow. The water becomes the color of weak tea, stained by the tannins that leach from mangrove roots. Fish move through this amber water in slow shadows. The tops of the walls catch the first light, while their bases remain in darkness. It is one of the few times of day when a visitor can see the full height of the ruins with clarity. By mid-morning, the ceiling of leaves closes the light down again. The canals return to their green shade. Sound becomes softer here as well, because the mangroves absorb noise the way they absorb light. A voice does not carry. A paddle stroke barely echoes. Even birds seem to speak more quietly among these trees. Some visitors say the whole place feels hushed, as if the mangroves are asking for silence. The mangroves also matter to the archaeologists who study the site. Their roots grip the stones. Their trunks push against walls. In some places, a mangrove has grown directly through a fallen basalt column, splitting it slowly with the pressure of decades. This makes the ruins harder to map and harder to preserve. Yet, the same roots also shelter the walls from the worst of the storms. When a typhoon rakes the reef, the mangroves take the first blow. They break the force of the wind and the surge. What might have battered the stones to pieces is softened by that living wall of wood. One question that remains open is how much of Nan Madol the mangroves are hiding. Aerial surveys have shown outlines of walls and platforms deep inside the thickets, places where no one has walked in a long time. Some researchers wonder whether entire sections of the city still lie beneath the roots, unmeasured and unmapped. Others believe most of the main structures are already known, and that the mangroves conceal only rubble and outer paths without cutting the trees, which no one wishes to do. The question is hard to answer. At sunset, the light returns for a brief second act. It comes in from the west now, low and red, and it turns the water of the canals to copper. The tops of the walls glow for a moment. Then the sun drops, and the mangroves become a black silhouette against a purple sky. Night settles over the reef. The stones cool, the canals grow still, and Nan Madol slips back into the soft green dark that has kept it and hidden it for so long. If you close your eyes and try to hear Nan Madol as it once was, the sound that returns first is water. Water is always the sound of this place. The lagoon laps against the outer walls in a slow, patient rhythm. Small waves slip through the canals between the islets. Raindrops on basalt in the wet season, which is most of the year. Under that steady wash of water, though, there once lived a whole world of human voices, and the story those voices told, passed down through generations, is the story of the chiefs who built the city and the chiefs who lost it. The oral histories of Pompeii speak of a dynasty called the Sorcerers. According to tradition, this line of rulers unified the island and directed the building of Nan Madol over many centuries. Their name is often translated as something close to Lord of Delure, Delure being an old name for the region under their command. The stone city grew island by island, wall by wall. The sounds of that construction must have been enormous. The scrape of ropes, the creak of wooden sleds, the deep hollow knock of basalt column against basalt column as each piece settled into place, the voices of workers calling out to one another across the shallow water. We do not know how many workers there were. Estimates range widely, and the honest answer is that the population of Pohnpei at the height of the Saudeleur period is not firmly known. Some researchers suggest tens of thousands, others argue for a smaller society that pulled off the project through sheer duration rather than sheer numbers. Both views remain on the table. What the oral traditions agree on is that the Saudeleur held power with a heavy hand. They demanded tribute. They gathered food and labor from across the island. They shaped a small kingdom from a scattering of villages, and they poured that kingdom into stone. The traditions also say that this power grew harsh over time. Later Sodel rulers in the stories became cruel and grasping. They demanded more than the people could give. They insulted the old gods. And so, according to the oral history, a warrior named Isokeleko arrived from the east, from the island of Kosrae, with a small band of followers. In the tale, he challenged the last Saudeleur, defeated him, and ended the dynasty. Whether Isokeleko was a single person or a compressed memory of many events, no one can now say. The story has been retold for generations, and each retelling smooths and shapes it a little more. What we can say is that after the fall of the Saudeleur, Nan Madol continued to be used, but differently. The new rulers, the Nanwaki, held court on the main island of Pohnpei and visited the stone city for ceremonies. The great construction projects seemed to have slowed and then stopped over time. Fewer people lived on the islets. The canals emptied of daily traffic. The sounds of the place softened into the sounds of wind, water, and birds. Archaeology can only listen faintly to any of this. Radiocarbon dates from the site suggest that major construction happened between roughly the 12th and 17th centuries, though earlier occupation of the Reef flat may reach back further. The oral histories fit loosely into that window, but they do not line up neatly with any single archaeological layer. So we are left with two different kinds of memory. One is written in stone and shell and charcoal, quiet and stubborn and hard to read. The other is written in spoken words, carried in the voices of elders, warm and specific and sometimes contradictory. Neither one is complete on its own. There is something moving about that gap. The chiefs who ordered these walls raised probably believed their names would echo through the basalt for as long as the sea kept its shape, and, in a way, they were right. Their titles survive. Fragments of their deeds survive. But the individual voices, the arguments in council, the orders shouted across the lagoon, the songs sung at the launch of a stone raft, all of that has faded into the general hush of the place. What remains is a kind of low, continuous sound, the sound of a society that once was busy here and is not busy here now, tonight. As you listen, imagine that murmur beneath the water, the chiefs who built, the chiefs who fell, the workers whose names were never written and never needed to be, all of them held together by a project so ambitious that even now, centuries later, we are still trying to hear what they were saying to one another across the quiet canals of their strange and beautiful city. On the island of Pohnpei, the old stories are still spoken. They pass from grandparent to grandchild in the quiet hours, the way water passes through the canals of Nan Madol. And within these stories, there are numbers, small ones, careful ones, numbers that have survived hundreds of years without ever being written down. The oral histories remember, for instance, 16 chiefs of the Saudeleur line, one after another, ruling from the stone city on the reef. 16 reigns, 16 names, 16 lifetimes stacked one upon the other, like the basalt logs themselves. If each reign lasted, on average, somewhere near 20 or 30 years, then the dynasty could have spanned 5 or 6 centuries. That is a long, steady arithmetic, held in memory alone. Whether it is exact, no, one can say, but the shape of it, the count of it, has not been lost. The stories also remember two brothers, 2 sorcerers, 2 founders who came from somewhere across the sea and raised the first stones. In many versions, they are twins, mirrored figures, one slightly older, one slightly younger. The number 2 runs through the site itself, in a strange, quiet way. The islets often pair off across narrow channels. Walls face walls, enclosures echo enclosures. Whether the builders were thinking in 2s on purpose, or whether the pattern only feels that way to us now, is another open question. There are 92 islets. That number is not from legend. It comes from careful counting by modern surveyors, who walked and paddled the site with maps in hand. 92 small platforms of stacked stone, spread across roughly 75 hectares of shallow reef. That is a little less than 1 square kilometer of built land, raised out of the lagoon by human hands. The math, when you sit with it, is quietly staggering. 92 artificial islands, thousands of stone columns, 1 reef. Estimates of the total weight of basalt used at Nan Madol vary, but many careful guesses land somewhere between 750,001 and 500,000 tons. That range is wide on purpose. No one has weighed every stone, no one ever will, but even the low end of that range is an enormous number for a small island with no draft animals, no wheels, and no metal tools. Divide that weight across 5 or 6 centuries of building, and you get a slow, patient rate. A few tons a day, a single heavy column, perhaps, every week or 2, a pace a village could keep. If the village never stopped, the columns themselves carry their own quiet mathematics. Basalt, when it cools slowly inside the earth, tends to crack into shapes with 5 or 6 or 7 sides. 6 is the most common. This is not magic. It is simply the geometry of cooling. A hot liquid, shrinking evenly in all directions, will split into a honeycomb, because a honeycomb is the shape that uses the least energy to divide a plane into equal pieces. Bees know this. Soap bubbles know this. Cooling lava knows this too. The builders of Nan Madol did not invent the shape of their stones. They found it already waiting for them in the cliffs, and they carried it, piece by piece, out to the reef. The oral histories remember distances too, though not in kilometers. They remember them in journeys. From the quarries on the far side of Pohnpei to the lagoon at Medellennihim is roughly 25 to 30 kilometers by sea, depending on which quarry and which route. That is a full day of paddling for a loaded canoe. Perhaps longer if the stones were floated on rafts. Multiply that by the number of columns, and the arithmetic becomes a kind of meditation. Trip after trip, tide after tide, generation after generation, and there is one more number worth sitting with. The tombs at Douwas, the largest funerary enclosure, have inner walls that rise about 7.5 meters above the reef. The outer walls are lower, the inner walls higher, forming a nested rectangle. That simple ratio, an outer ring and an inner sanctuary, appears in sacred architecture all over the world. It is not proof of any shared origin. It is only proof that human minds working with heavy stone and a sense of the sacred tend to arrive at similar shapes. The oral histories still remember what the written records never captured, and within their patient counting, within their 16s and their 2s, and their brothers who came from the sea, there is a kind of mathematics older than any equation. It is the arithmetic of memory, carried across centuries by voice alone. How much of it is exact, we may never know. When the tide falls at Nan Madol, something strange happens. The water that fills the canals slips away, quietly, patiently, drawn out towards the wider lagoon. Stone, that has been hidden all morning, slowly rises into the soft tropical light. Along the outer walls of Nan Douwas, the great funerary islet, a new geometry appears. The lower courses of basalt, wet and dark with algae, come into view like the bones of the reef itself. Nan Douwas is the largest and most famous of the islets. Its outer walls rise nearly 8 meters above the water in some places, built from long basalt columns stacked in a crossed pattern, header and stretcher, like an enormous woven basket made of stone. At low tide, you can see how the builders set their first courses directly onto the living coral. The reef is the foundation. The reef is what holds this weight up, and that is where the fragile balance begins. Coral is alive. It grows slowly, one tiny polyp at a time, laying down calcium carbonate in warm, shallow, sunlit water. The reef beneath Nan Madol is not a passive slab of rock. It is a community of countless small animals, each contributing to the platform that carries the ruins. If the water grows too warm, the coral bleaches and dies. If the water grows too muddy, the coral suffocates. If the sea rises too fast, the coral cannot keep up. The whole city rests on a living thing that has kept itself alive for thousands of years. The builders seem to have understood this, or at least they chose the place well. Pohnpei sits in a band of the western Pacific, where sea temperatures stay relatively steady, where the reef has time to recover from storms, where the lagoon shelters the inner islets from the full force of the open ocean. The mangroves along the shore filter runoff from the mountain. The mountain itself catches rain from the trade winds and sends fresh streams down through the forest. Every piece of this system supports every other piece. Consider how many variables had to line up. If Pohnpei had been a few degrees closer to the equator, the reef might have grown differently or been battered more often by cyclones. If the volcanic core of the island had produced softer stone instead of columnar basalt, there would have been nothing to quarry. If the lagoon had been a little deeper or a little shallower, the canals might not have worked as waterways. If the tides had a different range, the low tide reveal of the foundations might have been more brutal, cracking stone with each daily cycle. The city sits at a quiet intersection of many small conditions, each one just right. At low tide, researchers have measured the walls of Nan Douwas and found something that troubles them gently. The lower courses appear to have been laid when the sea was slightly lower than it is today. Some stones now sit below the waterline that once, perhaps, stood above it. One theory is that the sea has risen since the site was built, drowning the lowest steps. Another theory is that the islet itself is slowly settling into the reef, its enormous weight pressing down on coral that continues to grow beneath. A third possibility is some combination of both. The evidence is not yet complete. Whatever the cause, the balance is delicate. If sea level rises even a modest amount in the coming centuries, the tombs and enclosures will spend more of their days underwater. The salt will work deeper into the stone. The coral foundation may respond by growing upward or it may not. Corals in a warming ocean are already struggling in many parts of the Pacific. A reef that has quietly carried a stone city for perhaps 800 years cannot be counted on forever. There is something wondrous in this thought. The city was placed at a point of quiet equilibrium, and it has held there mostly through storms and centuries and the slow breathing of the tides. The stones are heavy, but the platform beneath them is soft and slow and alive. The whole thing works because a great many small conditions have not yet changed too much. At low tide, when the water pulls back and the dark lower stones emerge, you can almost see the whole system laid bare. The reef, the wall, the mangroves at the edge, the mountain rising behind. Each element leans on the others. Each element has its own patience, and somewhere in the middle of all this leaning and holding, the mystery of Nan Douwas rests quietly, waiting for the tide to turn again, waiting for the water to return and cover the ancient foundations once more. Beyond the walls of Nan Madol, past the last mangrove root and the final line of basalt, the reef falls away into deeper water. The lagoon opens, the coral shelf drops, and here, in the blue-green quiet beneath the surface, another part of the mystery begins. For as long as people have studied the stone city above the water, there have been quiet stories about what might lie below it. Not ghost stories exactly, more like whispered questions passed between fishermen and old chiefs. Modern divers have visited these waters for many decades now. They come with masks and fins, with underwater cameras, with soft lights that turn the murky water into something almost glowing, and they have reported, again and again, seeing shapes on the seafloor that do not look entirely natural. Long straight lines, blocks with flat faces, columns lying end to end, as if placed there rather than dropped. Whether these shapes are the remains of a submerged part of the city, or simply the strange clay of coral growth over fallen stones, remains an open question. One idea is that the sea level here has risen slowly over the centuries. If parts of Nan Madol were built lower down, closer to the ancient shoreline, then those parts could now sit underwater. In this view, the divers are seeing real ruins, outer walls, dock structures, perhaps ceremonial platforms that once stood in the open air. The stone city we see today would be only the upper portion of something larger. A competing view is more cautious. Some researchers think the shapes on the seafloor are natural. Columnar basalt, when it breaks apart, tends to fall in straight, block-like pieces. Storms have battered these reefs for thousands of years. Loose columns from the islets above could have tumbled into the deep water, settling into patterns that only look built. Coral, growing slowly over centuries, can smooth and shape fallen stone into forms that suggest human hands where there were none. Both ideas remain possible. The truth is that no one has yet mapped the underwater area around Nan Madol in the careful, patient way it deserves. The water is often cloudy. The currents can be strong. Coral grows on everything, softening edges, hiding joins, turning worked stone and natural stone into the same green shape. A team working there needs time, money, calm weather, and the blessing of the local community which cares deeply about the site. There are other quiet puzzles too. Divers have reported finding basalt columns far from any known quarry, resting on the reef in places that seem to have no clear purpose. Were these lost during transport, dropped from rafts that failed to reach the city, or were they placed there on purpose, marking a channel or a boundary that no one now remembers? Nobody knows. The columns lie where they lie, waiting. There is also the question of what might be hidden inside the islets themselves. below the visible walls. The foundations of Nan Madol sit on and within the coral reef. Cores taken by researchers have shown that the builders piled up coral rubble, then layered basalt on top. But how deep do the built layers go? Are there earlier walls buried beneath the ones we can see, hinting at older phases of the city? A few small studies have suggested there may be, but the work is slow, and the reef does not give up its secrets easily. For divers, though, the pull of these questions is part of the wonder. Each visit brings the same soft blue light, the same drifting fish, the same green-furred stones, and each visit brings the possibility, however small, of noticing something new. A shape that was not seen last year, a line of blocks revealed by a shifting current, a hint of pattern where before there was only tangle. The remarkable thing is how much remains unknown here, even now. We live in an age of satellites and sonar, of computer models and deep-sea drones, and yet a great stone city on a Pacific reef, one of the most striking human creations anywhere on Earth, still holds parts of itself back. The record above the water is unfinished. The record below the water is barely begun. Somewhere between the two, the full story of Nan Madol is waiting. Maybe future divers will bring back clear images of a submerged lower city. Maybe they will find only fallen stones and honest coral. Either answer would be its own kind of gift. For now, the reef keeps its shapes, the columns rest where they rest, and the quiet water above them holds a question that no one has yet been able to answer. The sea around Pohnpei is rising. Not quickly, not visibly from one visit to the next, but steadily, patiently, the way the sea has always done its slow work. And Nan Madol sits low against the water. Its outer walls already meet the tide. Its lower stones already wear the soft green fur of algae that never quite dries. Some of the smaller islets flood at high water, then drain again as the moon pulls the ocean back. What was once a floor is now a shallow pool. What was once a doorway is now a place where fish sometimes drift through. Nobody knows exactly how much time the stone city has lived in its current form. That is one of the quieter mysteries of the place. The rate of sea level rise in the western Pacific is not fixed. It shifts with warming oceans, with melting ice far away, with wind patterns that push water towards some shores and pull it from others. Some models suggest the reefs around Pohnpei will keep pace, growing upward as the water rises, because living coral does exactly that when conditions are right. Other models suggest the coral is already struggling, weakened by heat and bleaching, and may not be able to build fast enough. Which future arrives is still an open question. If the reef keeps up, the islets may stay roughly where they are, wet more often, dry less often, but recognizable. If the reef falls behind, the walls will slowly go under, not all at once, a stone at a time, a course at a time. The tallest walls of Nan Douwas would stand longest, dark shoulders above a widening lagoon, until even they became islands within islands, then shoals, then shapes that only divers would see. The record fades in other ways too. Every typhoon that sweeps across the eastern Caroline Islands brings wind and surge and rain that scours the walls. Mangrove roots keep pushing between the basalt logs, prying them apart with a patience that matches the seas. Rain washes loose the coral rubble that fills the cores of the platforms. Fine grains of information, the exact stacking, the small offerings once tucked between stones, the shape of a threshold, slip away year by year. Archaeologists work against this drift, mapping and photographing and drawing, trying to catch the ruins before another storm rearranges them. 1,000 years from now, the site may still be here in some form. Coral grows. Basalt is heavy and stubborn, but the pattern may be different. Some walls collapsed, some canals silted in, some islets swallowed by the sea and covered in living reef. If future visitors come, they may see only pieces, and they may struggle to read the whole. The unresolved questions we hold today: who moved the stones, how they moved them, why this reef, may become even harder to answer, because there will be less to study. A million years from now, the picture changes entirely. Pohnpei itself is a volcanic island, and volcanic islands do not last forever. They sink. The heavy weight of the basalt pushes them slowly down into the seafloor, and erosion wears them from above. Around them, coral atolls sometimes form, rings of reef where the mountain used to be. In deep time, Pohnpei may follow that path. The stone city, so carefully built on a living reef, may end up beneath a new reef of its own, its walls buried under coral that grew after it, its basalt columns fossilized inside a limestone crust. A billion years from now, the continents will have moved. The Pacific plate that carries Pohnpei is drifting northwest at roughly the speed a fingernail grows. Given enough time, that motion carries islands into subduction zones, where they slide beneath other plates and melt back into the mantle. The very rock that was quarried, hauled and stacked into walls may return to the deep heat it came from. Not lost exactly, recycled, its atoms rearranged into new stone that some future world may or may not lift into new mountains. There is a strange comfort in that long view. The mystery of Nan Madol is bound to the moment when humans can still see the walls, still walk the canals, still wonder. That moment is not forever. It began recently in the deep time sense. It will end. The question of how the city was built and why is a question we hold now, briefly, as the tide moves through the streets and the mangroves lean closer. What we learn while the stones are still here. And that, quietly, is part of what makes the wandering feel worth doing. Now we step back, all the way back, farther than the reef, farther than the island, farther than the ocean itself. We hold Nan Madol in our minds, and we let it become very small, one small pattern of dark stone on one small speck of green in the wide blue Pacific. And from this distance, the questions we have been asking begin to feel like something larger. They begin to feel like questions the whole planet is quietly asking about itself. The basalt in those walls was made deep inside the earth. Molten rock rose from the mantle, cooled slowly, and cracked into long columns as it lost its heat. That heat, in turn, came from the slow decay of atoms left over from the birth of the planet more than 4 billion years ago. So the stones the builders lifted, the stones they floated on rafts across the reef, are older than any human story. They were forged by the same deep fire that still shakes the earth today, and the atoms inside those stones are older still. The iron, the magnesium, the silicon locked into each dark column were made inside stars that died long before our sun was born, when those old stars collapsed and scattered their guts across the young galaxy. The pieces drifted for ages before gathering into the cloud that became our solar system. The reef holds those atoms now. The coral holds them. The bones of the people who once walked those causeways held them too. There is a quiet thought in this. The builders of Nan Madol, whoever they were made of the same material as the walls they raised. Their calcium, the calcium in their teeth and their spines, was cooked inside dying stars. The iron in their blood came from the same furnaces. When they lifted a basalt log onto a raft, star matter was lifting star matter. When they set it into place on the reef, the universe was, in some small way, arranging itself into a new shape. The reef beneath the city tells a similar story. Coral is built by tiny animals that pull calcium and carbon out of seawater and lay it down in delicate patterns. Each polyp is small, softer than a fingertip, and lives only a short while. But together, over thousands of years, they build structures visible from orbit. A reef is a slow city too. It is made by countless small lives working in the same place for a very long time. In that sense, Nan Madol is a stone city built on top of another city, one made of living creatures, one made of patient chemistry. Zoom out further, and the ocean itself becomes a kind of memory. Every drop of water in that quiet lagoon has fallen as rain, run through rivers, sunk into the deep, and risen again as vapor, over and over, for billions of years. The same water that lapped at the feet of the builders once flowed through the veins of ancient fish, once carved canyons on distant continents, once froze into glaciers and melted again. The tides that move through the sunken streets of the royal enclosure are pulled by the moon, which was itself born when a young planet struck the early Earth and threw a piece of it into orbit. Every high tide against Nan Douwas is, in a small way, an echo of that ancient collision. Held against all of this, the mystery of the builders becomes both smaller and larger at once. Smaller, because a few centuries of stone lifting on one reef is a brief thing in a story measured in billions of years. Larger, because it is one of the ways this planet has learned to look at itself. A small group of people, made of star matter, standing on a reef of coral, lifted pieces of the deep earth into the shape of a city, and then they left, and the mangroves came back, and the tide kept moving. We do not know why they built it. We do not know exactly how. We do not know what songs they sang while they worked, or what they believed the walls would hold. Those answers may come, they may not, but the stones themselves are still there, still humming with the heat of a young planet, still holding atoms older than our sun. They are patient, they have time, and on a quiet night, when the reef is dark and the water is warm, it is a soft comfort to know that the same universe that made those walls also made the listener, breathing slowly now, drifting towards sleep on the same small blue world. And so we come to the quiet close of our long, slow visit to the stone city on the reef. The night has grown deeper. The tide has turned somewhere far away, and the basalt walls of Nan Madol still stand in the warm Pacific dark, holding their questions gently, the way they have held them for centuries. Picture the sight now, as it truly is in this moment. The moon is a soft coin above the lagoon. Its light falls on the wet stone and the sleeping mangroves. The canals lie still between the islets, black and mirror smooth. A few small fish move through the shallows without a sound. The reef beneath the city breathes its slow coral breath, and nothing hurries, nothing at all. We may never know exactly how those long basalt columns crossed the open water. We may never learn the name carved, or never carved, into the deepest wall of the great tomb. The chiefs who once ruled here are gone. The workers who lifted the stones are gone. The songs they sang while they worked have faded into the wind and the rain. What is left is the shape of the effort, the outline of a dream someone once had, built out of dark, heavy rock, on a reef in the middle of the sea. There is something kind about a mystery that stays a mystery. It reminds us that the world is still wide, that not everything has been mapped and measured and settled, that people can build something so strange and so large that even now, with all our tools, we can only stand at the edge of the canals and wonder. Wonder is a soft feeling. It does not demand answers tonight. It only asks that we notice how much there is to notice. Let your thoughts drift out from Pohnpei now. Rise slowly above the reef in your mind. See the 92 little islets from above, laid out like dark stones in a shallow silver dish. See the ring of white surf where the ocean breaks on the outer reef. See the green heart of the island, its jungle mountains soft under cloud. See the wide Pacific stretching in every direction, its long swells moving in patient lines toward shores you will never visit, and then wider still. See the great blue curve of the ocean covering half the world. See the moonlight sliding across it. See the coasts of distant continents, where other old walls stand in other quiet nights, keeping their own secrets. Deserts full of stars, forests full of small breathing things, mountains that have not moved for 10 million years, all of it turning, slowly, together. Our planet is doing what it has always done. It is spinning through the dark, carrying its oceans and its stones and its sleeping people, and its curious mysteries. It does not need us to solve anything tonight. It only asks that we rest. The stone city on the reef will still be there in the morning. The tide will rise and fall through its canals, as it has done through countless mornings before. The mangroves will drop their small leaves. The coral below will keep its long, patient work. Somewhere, a fisherman may pass in a quiet boat and glance at the walls and think for a moment of the hands that stacked them. Then he will look away, and the walls will keep their secrets, and the day will begin without any answers changing. You are safe. You are small in a good way, held by a very old world that has room for you in it. Your breathing has slowed. Your body is warm. The questions we asked tonight are still open, and that is fine. They will wait. They have waited for many centuries already. Let the image of the moonlit lagoon settle behind your eyes. The dark basalt, the silver water, the soft distant sound of surf beyond the reef, the mangroves keeping their long green watch, the stones sleeping under the stars, exactly where they were placed, by hands we do not know, for reasons we can only guess. We may know more in 100 years, we may know less. For tonight, it is enough to have wandered together. It is enough to close our eyes on a planet full of unfinished stories, knowing that some of the most beautiful things in the world are the ones that stay a little bit unknown. Rest now. The stone city sleeps on, and so may you. Subscribe for a brand new Earth topic every night. One tap, and something wonderful is waiting for you tomorrow. Sweet dreams.